They didn't kick your door in, they knocked. And you let them in yourself. Picture a January morning. The air has that sharp, clean bite to it. The sun looks stunning and does absolutely nothing for warmth. Your house has been running off a generator for 4 days. You step outside, not because you wanted to. You stepped outside because the inside of your home has become a tightly organized operation and your brain needed a moment to decompress. Then a stranger walks up the driveway. Young guy, friendly energy. One of those high-visibility yellow-green vests that somehow communicates institutional authority without a single word spoken. No weapon on him, no raised voice. Just a clipboard in one hand, a government seal printed near the top, and a smile that probably cost 3 days of customer service training to develop. He explains the situation. The regional hospital's backup power is failing. Fuel reserves are nearly gone. Patients are on life support. Others are mid-surgery. He isn't making threats, he's making an appeal. To your decency, to your sense of community, to the version of yourself you were raised to be. And here's where it gets real. You feel it immediately, the guilt. You're not a bad person. That's the whole problem. You prepared because you saw this coming, and now the scenario you prepared for is standing in your driveway with a form and a sympathetic expression. Every instinct your upbringing installed in you is firing at once. Help people, be a good neighbor, trust the process, cooperate with authority. So you walk him around to the shed, you gesture at the cans, you take the pen he offers, and you sign. 4 minutes later, without a raised voice, without a broken lock, your fuel is gone. Nobody stole anything, nobody threatened you, you were processed. There is a difference between being robbed and being processed. And internalizing that difference might be the most important mental shift you can make before a situation like this lands on your actual doorstep. This isn't a video for people who want comfort. If you're here hoping to hear that systems will hold, that relief is incoming, that it all works out in the end, genuinely, without condescension, this isn't the right content for you. There's no shortage of reassuring material online, but if you've been watching how temporary emergency powers seem to outlast the emergencies that justified them, if historical precedent makes you uneasy rather than dismissive, if you'd rather understand the mechanics of what gets taken during a real collapse than pretend it doesn't happen, stay. Right here. What follows is a detailed breakdown of exactly what disappears first when a serious infrastructure failure plays out, why it disappears, what legal architecture makes it all completely legitimate on paper, and what you can realistically do about it before the guy with the clipboard becomes your actual problem. Point 1. Fuel. Let's say the quiet part loudly. Your fuel isn't really yours, not in the way you think it is. You paid for it. You stored it. You have documentation. But under a declared national emergency, the legal relationship between citizens and their physical resources shifts fast, and most people don't realize it's happening until someone is already loading their cans into a vehicle. The Defense Production Act grants the federal government broad authority over materials deemed critical to national security and infrastructure. Executive orders have extended that authority to energy resource allocation during crisis periods. Those orders remain on the books. They were never walked back. In plain terms, when fuel becomes scarce and a declared emergency is in effect, infrastructure gets priority. Hospitals, emergency services, water treatment facilities, communication networks. Anyone sitting on a supply that could serve those functions is, in the government's framing, temporarily holding a national resource. They don't call it confiscation. They call it requisition. They call it emergency allocation. A form gets signed. Sometimes a compensation promise gets attached. That promise is, in practice, worth very little. Most people preparing for an emergency think about fuel in terms of volume. How much do I have? How long will it last? What they almost never think about is visibility. Volume without concealment is just an inventory list waiting to be discovered. A large above-ground tank in your backyard isn't a survival asset. It's a landmark. It's visible from the road. Your neighbors watched it get delivered. The truck that delivered it was not designed to be discreet. In a serious crisis scenario, that tank gets requisitioned before your second cup of coffee. So how do you actually approach this differently? You stop thinking like someone who stockpiles and start thinking like someone who distributes, not in a cinematic way, in a practical, low-drama, effective way. Decentralization is the core principle. Break your supply into smaller containers across multiple storage points. Some in the basement, some in a work vehicle, some in a shed that also holds enough ordinary clutter to avoid communicating that any kind of system exists. Nothing that looks like a depot. Spread it out so no single point tells the whole story. You also use decoys. This is simpler than it sounds. Keep 2 or 3 cans, partially full or empty, in the most obvious, accessible by the garage, visible, findable. If a requisition team shows up, you give them the obvious stuff. You look cooperative. You look like someone who barely has enough. They log it, check a box, and leave. Your actual supply, the portion you've distributed and concealed, stays where you put it. The psychological layer matters as much as the logistical one. People who look like they're just scraping by don't attract sustained scrutiny. People who look extensively prepared become priorities, not just for government requisition, but for every other opportunistic scenario that emerges when social order degrades. Point 2. Precious metals. Here's a history lesson that gets cited frequently in preparedness circles but rarely gets thought through in terms of what it actually means today. 1933. An executive order required private citizens to turn over monetary gold, coins, bullion to Federal Reserve banks at a set price. Non-compliance carried criminal penalties. People who hadn't genuinely internalized that this had happened tended to be caught completely off guard. Now, a lot of people hear that and say, different era, different political climate, couldn't happen now. And they may be right. But the mechanism isn't what matters. The mechanism was confiscation through policy, criminalization. And that specific tool is not a historical artifact. You don't need the government to physically take your gold. You just need them to make it impossible to use. If every transaction involving precious metals triggers a flag, if possession becomes something to conceal rather than something you can openly trade, your stack of silver rounds has shifted from asset to liability. The value hasn't changed. The usability has. The practical response here isn't to abandon metals entirely, it's to think in terms of tiers and timing. Small denomination silver has genuine utility in a barter economy precisely because it's transactable. A 1-ounce silver coin can change hands for everyday goods in ways that a gold bar simply cannot. But the more important principle is diversification across asset classes. No single store of value should carry your entire preparedness strategy. Metals have a role. That role is specific. Know what it is before you need it. Point 3. Food and water. Emergency powers over food distribution are not hypothetical. They've been implemented at various scales repeatedly throughout modern history. Rationing systems, price controls, forced allocation of agricultural output, these aren't dystopian fiction. They're documented policy. And in a serious supply chain disruption, the framework for implementing them again exists and is ready to be activated. The conversation in emergency management isn't should we allocate food resources, it's how quickly can we implement the structure to do it. What that means for your stored food supply is roughly the same thing it means for your fuel. Visibility is the vulnerability. A garage packed floor to ceiling with labeled bins communicates something immediately obvious to anyone who looks. The goal is a supply that is distributed, ordinary in appearance, and stored in ways that don't shout this person is ready for a long-term disruption. Rotation matters here too, not just for freshness but for normalizing your storage as something you regularly use rather than something you've been quietly accumulating. Water is its own category entirely. Most people severely underestimate how rapidly clean water becomes the critical constraint in an infrastructure failure scenario. Fuel runs out gradually. Food lasts weeks. Water becomes the problem within 72 hours for many people and within days for almost everyone. Municipal water systems depend on power. When the grid goes down for extended periods, water pressure drops, treatment systems fail, and contamination risks increase dramatically. What this means practically is that point-of-use filtration and purification capability is more durable than stored water volume. A filtration system that can process natural water sources gives you renewable access. A large tank of stored water gives you a fixed amount that eventually runs out and that can be spotted and requisitioned just like everything else. Point 4. Communication equipment. This one surprises people when it comes up in preparedness discussions. In a serious crisis, communication infrastructure tends to get centralized fast. There's a logical reason for it. Coordination of emergency response genuinely benefits from controlled communication channels. But the practical effect for individuals is that private communication capability becomes restricted. Amateur radio, handheld communication devices, and signal equipment have all appeared on requisition and restriction lists under various emergency frameworks historically. The FCC has authority to restrict civilian use of radio frequencies during declared national emergencies. This doesn't mean your equipment disappears, it means using it without authorization becomes a legal exposure. The response to this isn't to stop using communication tools, it's to understand the regulatory environment, get appropriately licensed where licensing is relevant, and develop communication protocols within your trusted network before the moment. Familiarity with your equipment built before the emergency is the thing that makes it functional during the emergency. Point 5. Medical supplies and capability. Medical resources get prioritized aggressively in declared emergencies. This part is fairly obvious and mostly justified. Hospitals get supply priority. Distribution systems redirect toward treatment facilities. What's less discussed is that this dynamic affects private medical supply caches in ways people don't anticipate. Certain categories of medical supplies, IV solutions, specific medications, oxygen equipment, have appeared on emergency allocation lists. The supplies you've accumulated don't disappear through direct confiscation in most cases. They become unavailable to replenish, unavailable to source through normal channels, and sometimes subject to formal requisition if the supply shortage becomes severe enough and your cache is visible enough. The response to this involves two distinct tracks. The first is the same decentralization and concealment principle that applies to every other category. The second, and more important, is capability development. Medical training, first aid proficiency, wilderness medicine skills, understanding of basic pharmacology, these are the aspects of medical preparedness that cannot be logged in any inventory or loaded onto any truck. Skill outlasts supply in nearly every sustained crisis scenario. Point 6. Food preservation equipment. This category sits right at the intersection of being genuinely useful and being genuinely visible. A large chest freezer, a commercial dehydrator, a pressure canning setup, these signal preparedness in ways that most other household items don't. They're also exactly the kind of equipment that becomes valuable to centralized resource management during a serious disruption. The problem with food preservation equipment isn't that it's wrong to have. The problem is that it's hard to normalize. A second freezer in the garage doesn't read as ordinary in the way that a second bookshelf does. The approach here blends concealment with documentation of normalization. Does your family can food regularly as a genuine practice? That's different from having a dedicated preservation operation that exists purely for emergency scenarios. The more integrated your food preservation practices are into your regular household routines, the less they stand out as a preparedness signal. Beyond the equipment itself, the knowledge component, actually knowing how to preserve food across multiple methods without relying on the equipment, is the more valuable and less requisitionable asset. Point 7. Your information and data. Most people in preparedness discussions focus on physical assets: fuel, food, metals, equipment. Far fewer people think about the category of informational assets and what it means for those to be accessible, archived, and protected. Digital records have a visibility profile that physical assets sometimes don't. Financial records, property documentation, supply inventories, communication logs, these exist in systems that can be accessed in ways that your basement supply cache cannot. In a serious crisis scenario, the ability to rapidly access your own documentation can be the difference between navigating a bureaucratic system effectively and being completely at its mercy. Physical backups of critical documents, stored in a secure and accessible location, are a genuinely underrated preparedness asset. Your ability to prove ownership, demonstrate prior arrangement, or document prior compliance is a tool in situations where you'd otherwise be entirely subject to someone else's records and their interpretation of them. Beyond personal records, there's the question of operational security around your preparedness profile in general. What can someone determine about your level of preparedness from publicly available information? Social media posts that show your storage setup, delivery records that indicate large supply purchases, conversations that happen around people you don't fully know yet. The aggregation problem is real. Individually innocuous pieces of information combined create an accurate picture of what you have and where you have it. The principle isn't secrecy as a personality trait, it's discretion as a strategic posture. Point 8. Your labor and skills. This is the asset that people least expect to see on a list like this, and it's one of the more important ones to think clearly about. Emergency powers in serious crisis scenarios have historically included provisions for directing labor, assigning people to specific tasks in service of broader emergency response efforts. The legal architecture for this exists. Whether it gets activated depends on severity. But more relevant on a day-to-day basis during a sustained disruption is the informal version of this dynamic. Skills become visible. The person who is known to have medical training gets called on constantly. The person known to have mechanical expertise becomes a resource that everyone wants access to. This isn't always a bad thing. Being valued in a community has obvious benefits, but it creates obligations, time demands, and leverage points that other people can use against your interests if they choose to. The response isn't to hide your skills. It's to be thoughtful about who knows what you can do and what kind of relationships frame that knowledge. Skills offered within a reciprocal relationship are an asset. Skills exploited by people who see you purely as a resource are a liability. The deeper point here is that skill development is the preparedness investment with the best return profile across every scenario. Fuel can be taken. Food can be requisitioned. Equipment can be logged and removed. A skill set lives in your mind and body. It can't be inventoried. It can't be loaded into a truck. It's the most portable, most durable, most resilient asset class in your entire preparedness strategy. Point 9. Your defensive capability. Let's address this directly, because avoiding it doesn't serve anyone. In documented emergency situations, there have been cases where legally owned defensive equipment was confiscated from civilians in declared emergency zones. The legality of those actions was disputed. Subsequent legislation addressed some of the gaps, but the events happened, and the lesson they carry is not that it can never happen again. The lesson is that having a single point of failure in your defensive capability is a structural vulnerability that a serious strategy shouldn't have. The principle of distributed concealment applies here as directly as it applies to any other resource category. Defensive tools that are locked in one obvious location are deterrents to casual theft. They are not deterrents to an organized entity with both the legal standing and physical means to remove them from your property. Locked is not the same as hidden. That's not a minor semantic point. It's the difference between a security strategy and a security illusion. Knowing your state's specific statutory framework around emergency powers and defensive property is foundational, not optional. Some states have enacted explicit protections, others have not. Where you stand legally determines what your options are before a situation develops, and that's exactly when you need to know, not during it. The capability element, training, accuracy, tactical competence, the actual proficiency to use what you have, is the component that cannot be requisitioned by anyone under any framework. Time spent developing genuine capability is the highest return investment in this entire category. Stuff without skill is just inventory. If you're still here and still locked in, hit the like button on this video for my channel. It costs you nothing, and it helps this content find the people who need it most. Point 10. Your network. This is the asset that most people don't recognize as an asset at all. And because they don't recognize it, they haven't built it. And because they haven't built it, they'll be completely unable to draw on it when conditions deteriorate enough to make it matter. Solo survival is a compelling narrative. It's cinematically satisfying. The capable individual who doesn't need anyone else. It's also largely a myth. Every documented case of successful community survival through extended crisis periods involves groups, people with complementary capabilities, shared resources, divided labor, mutual security arrangements, and the kind of psychological stability that comes from not being alone in a difficult situation. That last piece, psychological stability, is consistently undervalued and consistently decisive. The challenge with network building as a preparedness strategy is that it has to happen before you need it, using normal social dynamics without broadcasting your preparedness status in ways that create the visibility problems we've discussed throughout this entire video. That tension is real. There's no formula that makes it disappear entirely, but the general structure looks something like this. Start by identifying people in your immediate geographic area, close enough to reach on foot if necessary, who demonstrate thoughtfulness, practical capability, calm under pressure, and a general orientation toward self-reliance. You don't need to have explicit preparedness conversations with all of them immediately. You need to know who they are and have a functional relationship as a foundation to build from. Within that broader group, identify a smaller circle, the people with whom you can be genuinely direct. Here's what we're thinking about. Here's what we've done. Here's how we might help each other if things become difficult. Mutual awareness within this inner circle is itself a resource. Knowing that someone nearby has medical training or mechanical skills or a specific capability you lack changes your risk profile even before any formal arrangement is made. Skills diversification within a trusted group compounds in ways that individual preparation cannot match. Medical knowledge, mechanical expertise, agricultural capability, communication skills, Each person's strengths strengthen the whole group in ways no single individual can replicate alone. The group becomes more capable than the sum of its parts, and that excess capability is what keeps people functional when conditions are genuinely hard. Your network is the one asset that no government form can legally requisition. Relationships are not enumerated in databases. Community trust doesn't have a physical form that can be loaded into a vehicle and driven away. It exists entirely in the choices people have made to invest in each other over time. And it is, without close competition, the single most valuable and most neglected preparedness asset that exists. Pulling it all together, step back and look at the shape of everything we've covered. The thread running through all 10 points isn't secrecy for its own sake. It isn't hostility toward institutions. It isn't paranoia dressed up as strategy. It's a clear-eyed recognition that visibility creates vulnerability across every resource category, and that the most durable preparedness posture isn't the one with the largest supply, it's the one with the deepest capability and the smallest profile. The government in emergency response mode is not a villain in a simple story. It's a large, slow, under-resourced system trying to manage a crisis with incomplete information and enormous pressure to appear as though it's doing something. The tools it uses, requisition, emergency allocation, resource prioritization, exist because in genuine mass emergencies, some degree of centralization genuinely helps. The problem is that you are not a resource to be managed. You're a person who has taken responsibility for your own situation, and the gap between those two framings is exactly what every point in this video has been navigating. Fuel, precious metals, food, communication equipment, medical supplies, preservation capability, your information, your labor, your defensive capacity, your network. 10 categories. Across all 10 of them, the principles remain consistent. Decentralize and distribute. Conceal what matters. Make your visible story unremarkable. Build your actual capability quietly and keep it close. Trust carefully and deliberately. Invest in skills wherever skills can substitute for stockpiles. Make yourself genuinely valuable to the people in your inner circle and as invisible as possible to every system that would treat you as inventory. If that framework reshapes how you approach your situation going forward, then you got real value from this. You made it to the end. That's genuinely rare. Most people won't make it this far. If anything in this breakdown shifted how you're thinking, if one of these points landed in a way that's going to stick, leave a comment below. Which point hit closest to home? Which category had you rethinking something you thought you had handled? Those conversations matter, and every response here gets read. Hit the like button for my channel. 2 seconds of effort that helps this reach people who would benefit from it. And if you want to keep getting this level of direct, no-filler breakdown of what real preparedness strategy actually looks like, subscribe. It's free. It takes 2 seconds. And it means you'll be here when the next one drops. Stay prepared. Stay